Good evening, and welcome to tonight's episode of The Bar. I'm your host, Brionna Denby, and I'm an attorney practicing white-collar defense and government affairs at the Wilmington office of Cohen-Seglius. Tonight, we will be discussing the important topic of abortions. 1 in 4 women have had an abortion, and so this medical procedure affects the women in your family, the women you work with, the women sitting next to you. Weeks before Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson was sworn into the bench of the United States Supreme Court, the highest court of the land, that court handed down a landmark decision, Dobbs v. Jackson, overturning the right to abortion. Tonight, we want to give you some background on the case law, provide some education around how we got here, and what we can do next. I have with me Professor John Culhane from Widener Law School. He is also the H. Albert Young Fellow in Constitutional Law. I also have Mike Brickner, and he's the Executive Director of ACLU Delaware. And I also have Dr. Michelle Duncan. She is the Associate Professor of Clinical Obstetrics, Gynecology, and Reproductive Sciences at the Lewis Katz School of Medicine at Temple University. So we're just gonna go ahead and get started tonight. So I first just wanna create the framework and the background on the case law. So could you give us some history, Professor, on the case law leading up to Dobbs?
Yeah, so as most of the viewers probably know, in 1973, the Supreme Court decided the landmark case of Roe versus Wade. And what that case did was build upon a number of other cases that had established a constitutional right to contraception and said that the woman's right to her own autonomy included a right to make the most fundamental decision about whether to continue or terminate a pregnancy. So that was Roe versus Wade in 1973.
Okay.
In 1992, the court decides Casey versus Planned Parenthood of Pennsylvania. And in that case, the court reaffirmed Roe, and there was some controversy about whether the court would do that. It was thought likely that the court would overrule Roe, but what they did instead was say, for a number of reasons, we're going to modify it a little bit, and we're going to let states pass laws that may restrict the right to abortion as long as they don't impose an undue burden on a woman's ability to make that decision.
Okay.
It's kind of a complicated standard to apply, but that's what the court said.
So
Yeah.
was that just the first iteration of whittling away at Roe v. Wade?
That's how I see it, in the
Okay.
sense that before that, the court had said that the states could really do not much until the point of viability of the fetus.
Okay.
And there had been a series of decisions, particularly in the few years leading up to Casey, where the court had expressed more willingness to uphold some state laws that really did seem to chip away at that.
Okay.
And so by the time Casey comes along, there's a strong belief that the court might just overrule Roe. And at the last minute, one of the justices switched his vote, that was Justice Kennedy, and in a 3-judge kind of joint opinion, they said, for a number of reasons, including this idea of precedent, right? That women had been relying on Roe for the last, 20 years,
Right.
and they had organized their economic lives, their personal relationships around this idea that they would be able to fully participate in the life of the nation. And if you take away the right to end a pregnancy, that affects all kinds of other things like decisions around contraception, most notably.
Okay.
So that was the case until a few weeks ago.
Okay.
And that brings us, as night follows day, to the Dobbs decision.
Okay, so we don't want to assume that our viewers have read the decision.
Yes.
Right, so we've heard about it on the news. Generally, we
Yeah.
know that it overturned Roe v. Wade, but could you give us some background,
Yeah.
a quick overview of the
Sure.
Dobbs case law?
Sure. So what happens in Dobbs is the court is faced with a challenge to a Mississippi law that said there can be no abortion after the 15th week of pregnancy. And that was in direct defiance of Casey, which said that until viability, which is way after 15 weeks, right? That the court can impose an undue burden. Well, prohibiting all abortions is obviously an undue burden.
Sure.
It's a complete burden. So the court originally took the case and was thought they would just resolve that issue. But as the case came up for oral argument, and by the time the case comes before the Supreme Court, we have a change in membership. And we have the untimely death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg right before the 2020 election. Her instantaneous replacement almost by Amy Coney Barrett, who is much more conservative. And the court, in a kind of a fractured decision, but we had 5 justices in the majority who struck down Roe and Casey. And what they said was that that Casey in particular was built on this idea of women having a liberty interest, a fundamental interest in making that choice to have an abortion. And the court almost really didn't talk about that very much. And what it said instead was, well, the right to abortion is not deeply rooted in our nation's history. Well, of course it isn't. In the sense that women couldn't vote until 1920. Women were not even legal people until the latter part of the 19th century. Lots of crazy things that we take for granted are just crazy now, right? And the contraception decisions, those cases were not deeply rooted either.
I mean, not even thought of.
Not even, at
the creation of our nation's history.
And even when the 14th Amendment was adopted after the Civil War, that wasn't really on people's minds. So this idea that we can only look at the history, that was an older view of the liberty, interest. But in recent cases, like the same-sex marriage case, the court said, we've kind of done away with that. We now look at all kinds of factors, and what really is fundamental, what are the things around family and marriage, and procreation that people hold the most fundamental, and those we're going to protect as strong liberty interests. The court didn't even discuss that. Instead, the court said, well, in other areas like right to physician-assisted suicide, we haven't applied that. We've looked at history and didn't even talk about these things. So it's a radical decision, in my opinion. And what it does is it doesn't mean that that women can't get an abortion. What it means is that each state gets to make that decision. So no longer is it a constitutional, foundational right, but now the states can do sort of what they want. And some states have already used these trigger laws that went into effect at the moment that Dobbs was decided. And so there are plenty of women throughout the country who have found that their right to terminate their pregnancy has been abrogated, has been done away with.
Well, let me bring you, Mike, into the conversation. I mean, from the advocacy perspective, what does that mean for Delawareans?
Well, it means many different things. I think, first of all, there were several state leaders here in Delaware who I think had very good foresight. And back in 2017, when they saw President Trump elected, they very quickly knew that that meant that he was going to appoint new folks to the U.S. Supreme Court, and that we needed to codify Roe versus Wade into state law. And so in 2017, the state legislature did that. And so Delaware is one of about a dozen states that has actually codified Roe versus Wade and said that abortion access and abortion rights are guaranteed under state law. But rights and access are two very different things.
Talk about that.
So we're looking at, yes, we're a state that we have guaranteed those rights, but what does our country look like when we have 26 states that are very likely to ban abortion within the next few months? And we may have more after that. Right now we have a governor in Pennsylvania that would veto any sort of legislation that would come out of an anti-choice legislature. But they're electing a new governor this year. We have a one-vote threshold, a pro-choice threshold in the Virginia legislature. If this year's election goes where they elect more anti-choice legislators, Virginia could pass restrictions and bans. And so we could see other states start to ban. And the problem with that is that then, with access here in Delaware, we're going to have more people who are going to be coming to the state looking for services. And
where would a woman go to get an abortion in Delaware? I mean, what options does she have?
So in Delaware, the only abortion provider that we really have is Planned Parenthood. Our hospitals will do them as well, but generally it's Planned Parenthood, and they have locations in Wilmington, Dover, and Seaford.
Okay.
But generally, the wait is oftentimes a few weeks to get an appointment, as it stands right now.
Okay.
And so, having that true access is oftentimes difficult because we don't always have enough physicians, enough qualified medical professionals.
So wait, is this no longer a procedure that can be performed in a medical office, in an OBGYN office in Delaware?
So it can be performed other places, but generally it is mostly done at Planned Parenthood facilities or oftentimes in hospitals, but very much less frequently in hospitals.
So if there's already a waiting list here in Delaware, if we do have some of the nearby and neighboring states, the Pennsylvanias, the Virginias, and even those southern states, I've seen the maps, coming to Delaware in droves to take advantage of our laws to try to get an abortion.
Well, and then also put your feet in the shoes of the people who are going to be coming to Delaware, or just normal everyday Delawareans who are trying to get access. We may also see where there are a lot of financial obstacles.
Okay.
So people who may not be able to afford the procedure itself, or people who are having to travel long distances or get childcare or have to take time off of work. Here in the state of Delaware, we have not yet chosen to allow Medicaid to cover abortion services. So for low-income people, that is a huge obstacle.
And what is the cost of an abortion right now in Delaware?
On average, it's about $515 for the procedure. It could be more expensive if you're later on in your term. But then again, you add on transportation, childcare, all of those other costs, and you're looking at potentially a few $1,000s that somebody might have to spend in order to access an abortion.
Wow. So Dr. Duncan, what medical piece could you add to the conversation around abortions?
So one of the primary things that I always think of when I listen to this conversation is it's always about the choice and the elective termination of the pregnancy, and for whatever reason that a woman says that this is not the time and the place or the thing for me. And in the national conversation, you often hear the other side extorting people to be more selective in their choices and to avoid getting pregnant, and therefore it wouldn't be a problem. But truthfully, abortion care is health care. It is part of women's care. It is not just something that that is important to a certain segment of the population, or women, or this or that. This comes into play if you are married and you want to be pregnant and you got pregnant and something went wrong.
Wow. So
if you start bleeding, your ability to stay alive is compromised if you are in a state where you cannot end that pregnancy. He mentioned that the hospitals do some of the abortions, but usually not. The abortions that the hospitals usually do are to save the life of the mother.
Wow.
So if you come in and you are sick, or you are infected, or you are bleeding, the only thing to do under those circumstances may be to proceed with a termination. That's the thing. And at what point do we say, well, what percentage of your life is appropriate for us to do this, right?
Wow.
So if you have a 20% chance of death, do we say that you should keep the pregnancy? But if you have a 60% chance of death, well, then that's too much.
Right.
And these things are what we don't think about. Ireland had a total ban on abortion that got reversed. And the reason that got reversed is they had a woman who was 17 weeks, 4.5 months pregnant, who got infected and who died because the physicians felt like, because the baby had a heartbeat, that they couldn't interrupt the pregnancy, which would have allowed the mom to live and to get the antibiotics and get the care that she needed. They felt like under the law in Ireland,
wow,
that the thing that they were being forced to do was to keep her pregnant. So it interrupts so many levels of care. It compromises who may choose to go into obstetrics and gynecology. It compromises who may choose to train where. If you do a residency program or a training program in a state that is quite restrictive, Like, how does that change what you learn to do and what you know to do?
Wow.
I personally trained in Texas at the University of Texas, UT Southwestern Medical Center at Dallas, Parkland Health and Hospital System. Well, right now, they've got a 6-week ban that includes legislation that says that private citizens can sue physicians for performing abortions. So what if someone comes in bleeding and they're having a miscarriage, because anywhere between 10 and 60% of pregnancies end in miscarriage, and some family member disagrees with the fact that you had to do a D&C because the woman was bleeding and sues you? Well, there is a diagnosis called inevitable AB, which may mean the fetus has a heartbeat, but there's no way this pregnancy is viable. So you have to interrupt it or else mom is at risk. So if we have laws on the books that were placed there by legislature, lawyers, people who don't practice medicine, it gets very, very, very difficult for physicians to do the right thing, to learn what the right thing is, to know how to take care of their patients. You go in a room and you have to have a discussion that is based on a law that was passed by somebody that doesn't understand fundamentally the pathophysiology of any of this, making decisions. That's just untenable. It risks the well-being, it risks the life, it risks the health, it risks everything for all women. And even you're not going to have the best OBGYN. So even care for any stage of life. If nobody wants to become an OBGYN because they're afraid of what's going on and that they might be jailed,
sued,
you're going to get only people who maybe shouldn't be practicing. You're not going to get the best of the best doing their best work because they're not going to want to be playing in that sandbox.
So let me bring Professor Culhane back into this conversation. So some of these other states which have already had these trigger laws in place, what happens to the mother who finds an abortion to be medically necessary in those instances?
Yeah, so it very much is a state by state kind of map. And so some states say, well, you know, if it's the life of the mother, then you can perform the abortion. But what about the health of the mother, right? Or to your point, the life of the mother, what does that mean? Does it have to be 60% or 20%? What if there's a 5% chance and somebody is second guessing it, right? So these things can't be separated in the way that these legislatures are trying to do this. Another important piece of this is that there are some states that are now seeking to kind of follow women into states where they are legally permitted to get abortions and to try to stop them through mechanisms similar to what Texas did in getting other people to kind of rat them out and to basically, to use a colloquial term, and to basically say, well, you know, some doctor in this other state performed this, and try to get kind of extraterritorial is a fancy way, but out of state jurisdiction over those people. Now, I will say that whether they could successfully do that is, I think, pretty unlikely. But whether this Supreme Court would allow that to happen, I think is anyone's guess. One of the concurring opinions by Justice Kavanaugh, he did say that in his view, you know, sort of chasing people who have left the state and prosecuting them or people who abetted them with the abortion, in his view, would be going too far. So maybe the court's not willing to go that far, but it certainly raises concerns, right, until those laws are successfully challenged, that people may feel like, well, I'm in Missouri or whatever state, that was one of the states where this was proposed. I don't want to leave to go to Minnesota, which would be maybe the closest place, to get an abortion because of all the risks to people around me. So it's way more complicated than it looks on the surface.
So I want to really touch on that again, because I think about people or women who go away, like far away to college. I went to college in Georgia, and if I said in the laws in those southern states, the abortion rights are at risk there. So if I'm in Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and say, gosh, I need to get an abortion for this and that reason, I need to finish school, let me travel up north, let me travel to the New Yorks, the Delawares. what would happen, or what are the risks associated with traveling to get an abortion and then traveling back, maybe on an airplane, such a far distance? I want to ask you that, Dr. Duncan.
So generally speaking, another thing that people don't realize is there's just a certain amount of underlying risk to being pregnant. So you're at increased risk of what we call pulmonary embolism, which is where you get a blood clot, usually in your legs or your lower body, and it breaks off and it goes to your lungs, and you die. Any type of immobilization, anything like that, puts you at higher risk. So the further on in pregnancy someone is, just being pregnant, if they're on a plane, we tell them, oh, you've got to get up, you've got to walk, you've got to stretch, you've got to move, because you're at increased risk. In COVID, one of the things that we've seen is that there's an increased risk of clots, and that's really one of the things. So we have pregnant women taking medications to decrease their risk of clots. So anytime you talk about extended travel and extended time in someone who's in a hyperestrogenic state, pregnancy, then you're talking about multiple risks. Now, it's not sky high if you're 10 weeks, if you're 11 weeks. And by the time you get close to viability, you're still fairly early in pregnancy, technically, from our standpoint. But overall, there are still risks to just moving around like that, because pregnancy is risky.
Right.
There is just baseline morbidity problems, mortality that are associated with it that we often just overlook and don't realize, because we just say, oh, it's this beautiful, wonderful, natural thing.
Right.
And, I often invite people to go look at cemeteries from the 1800s and look at how many, headstones of moms and babies are in there for this beautiful, natural, wonderful thing.
Yeah,
like,
there's a lot of risk
normal.
involved.
Exactly.
On this issue of travel, there was an important piece of legislation just passed that touches on that.
Okay.
Delaware House Bill 455. It was just signed by the governor last week, but one, it expands who's able to perform an abortion in the state.
Okay.
So now it allows advanced practice clinicians to provide abortion care, and those are nurse practitioners, physician's assistants. We're now one of about 16 states that allow those folks to do those procedures.
Okay.
But it also included some protections for folks who may be subject to criminal or civil liability out of state. So for instance, Missouri is one that has started to look to going outside of its territory. So let's say a college student is going to the University of Delaware, but she's originally from Missouri, and she gets an abortion in Delaware. Missouri could have criminal charges and investigations.
Wow.
They could file a lawsuit against the student, but also against the provider, her Uber driver, anybody who helped to fund the abortion. And so what Delaware's law does now is that it says that it will not cooperate in investigations with those states on those issues. It will not allow extradition. It won't allow subpoenaing of their personal medical history. And it will also allow them to have a right of action to file a lawsuit in the state of Delaware to recoup their legal fees. Now,
So not a civil action.
Right. So we don't think it's a perfect solution, because also think about the future, right? Let's say that I have an active warrant out for my arrest because I helped somebody to get an abortion here in Delaware. And let's say I get on a plane and I'm flying on Delta and I fly through Atlanta.
Right.
What if they have an anti-choice law on the books and I get arrested? Or let's say, someday Pennsylvania passes a fetal personhood law and it's banned in Pennsylvania, and I drive to Whole Foods to go shopping.
Right.
I could be pulled over and stopped. And so we're entering into these very kind of scary constitutional areas where we probably wouldn't have imagined something like this maybe 5 years ago.
Right.
But there's all of these, crazy chaos scenarios that could be coming our way in the future.
Wow.
One of the things that you talked about, which I want to amplify, is the drastic imposition on women's bodily autonomy that is created through pregnancy, and for women that willingly take on that risk, and for it's a wonderful thing, but it's a risky thing.
Right.
And the idea that even in a woman that is healthy and young and has a single child, because we know twins are riskier.
Right.
There are all kinds of things that can happen, right? And so the idea that, and the Supreme Court barely even sort of touched on that. really only focused on the fetus. And, you know, to me, that's enough all by itself.
Sure.
One of the things that Justice Amy Coney Barrett said during the oral argument was, well, yeah, there's some compromise to women's autonomy, but it's not that bad because they can always give the kid up for adoption.
Oh my goodness.
And that's wrong on so many levels.
Of course.
I don't even want to sort of discuss it, but you know, emotionally, women might not be able to do that once they carry the child to term.
Right.
This idea that it'll increase the stock of babies for other people to raise also has all kinds of terrible implications, you know, based on history and practice. So but I do want to emphasize that the compromise as the parent of, you know, twin teenagers that are going to be going to college next year, these things are very much present to a lot of us.
So, and I appreciate that. So I've really heard the comments as this ruling came down, with some men saying, well, it's a women's issue. I want to ask the panelists to talk about why abortion is not just a women's issue. And I do feel that there are some men, and sorry to my male guests, who just say, oh, you know, I'll pay for the pill, but there's so much risk involved for the woman, but at the same time, how is the male's lives benefited from that woman making that very difficult choice? So, Mike, I'm going to start with you.
Sure. So there's a couple of different answers, I think, to that. I think, first of all, looking at the constitutional law and the underpinnings that, you know, Roe really came out of the right to contraception, and then all of these other, you know, landmark Supreme Court cases came out of that same legal theory.
Yeah.
And so if we're suddenly saying, well, we're going to overturn this and say that women or pregnant people don't have full autonomy over their bodies, then who else doesn't have full autonomy over their bodies? Right. If you want to be in a same-sex relationship, or if you want to be transgender, gender non-binary, or if you want to use contraception while you're married, right? All of that is derived from the same school of thought. And so if we're accepting that, oh, it's okay for one group not to have bodily autonomy, what does that mean for the rest of us? Right. And then I think too, you know, to what we heard from the doctor over here, that, you know, access to the full spectrum of reproductive health care is vital to pregnant people's health and safety. Right. And if you know somebody in your life who either has been pregnant, will be pregnant, or is pregnant right now, and it is vital for them to have full access to all of these services that are out there, right?
Yeah.
Right.
You know, my father's mother died in childbirth just before the advent of antibiotics. All right, well, think about how the risk of pregnancy and the death of a mother affects the whole family, right? So my father was raised without a mother because of this.
Right.
So it has this knock-on effect to families, to communities,
Sure.
to the children of the women that are affected.
Right.
The economic lives of people can be horribly disrupted if they don't have the resources, either financial or psychological, or they're in a bad place for any number of reasons. So but I think the most fundamental point is the point you just articulated, Mike, this idea that it's all connected. And, you know, once upon a time we had a Supreme Court that said you could, you know, sterilize people. And I thought we had moved away from this.
It's getting awfully close.
And we were talking ahead of time, that case has never been overruled.
Not formally, right.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
right. That's right.
You guys know what case that is?
It's Skinner.
Skinner
versus Oklahoma.
Okay.
And where Justice Holmes allowed the sterilization of a woman who was considered, they used all kinds of different terms then, but mentally challenged, we would say today.
Right.
And he memorably said that 3 generations of imbeciles is enough.
Wow.
So you know, the court hasn't always been, we like to think of it until recently as the great protector of civil liberties, but it has a much more checkered history as anyone
and we do know that
has looked at the end of Reconstruction and what the court did to kind of put a stop to it. I mean,
and how they referred to African Americans, and how they referred to women. So I mean, that is just another example.
I mean, move forward 50 years. The Birth of the Nation, the movie, was first shown in the antechamber of the Supreme Court in 1918.
Wow.
That's
That's right.
and that celebrated the rise of the glorious KKK. So we forget when we look at what we have now. I find it funny though when they talk about, well, these rights were not guaranteed at the time. I'm like, well, at the time the Constitution was written, I believe that we were using leeches to bleed people for health problems.
Yeah.
So maybe if the justices have to get leeches for their heart problems, then they would think about this. It doesn't make any sense.
Right.
None of these things were available. None of the technology that we use was available. Now, I do hope that because medicine has moved forward from where we were in the 1960s and the 1950s, and where we talk about the problems that we saw, that we won't be facing that same thing. It will likely be an entirely different landscape. We've got new contraception, we've got new medication options, we've got a different understanding of the pathophysiology, we've got different antibiotics, we've got different skill sets and materials. So hopefully some of the worst, the horror stories that people talk about of those times we won't quite face. But there's a number of things that we haven't considered. We're at a 30-year low birth rate in the country, 35-year low birth rate in the country right now. Teen pregnancy is absolutely cratered for many reasons. And a lot of that has to do with the introduction of really good long-term contraception,
Birth control,
the introduction to really good teaching and training. We had a wonderful study that was done out of the Midwest maybe 10 years ago that showed if you offered women good quality contraception and you taught them how to use it, and you made sure that they understood how it worked, that they used it. And that study actually decreased, I believe it was in 1/2 of the population, it decreased the abortions in the teen population by 70-some%, just by giving women decent contraception. So we have done things in the intervening 50 years that hopefully will make a difference and will improve the overall health of women. But all of this is going to be new territory, and we're not appreciating how the risk is increasing, how our population is aging, how we're getting more and more ill, and how it's going to present.
Let me also ask the question about the abortion pill. I mean, we've heard about a number of states that if they are starting to whittle away at what used to be Roe versus Wade, and create these obstructions to getting an abortion. But we've also heard to make it more widely available to get an abortion pill. From the advocacy and from the ACLU perspective, Mike, what have you heard about that?
Yeah, so I think that it is a big wave of the future, and it's really already here, that many people are utilizing medication abortion, and that they are able to get it via telehealth and through the mail.
And I think I overstepped and jumped too quickly. Could you just maybe give an overview of what the abortion pill is?
So right now,
Dr.
what
Duncan.
they're using is a two-step process, and it's a combination of what sort of back in the day, RU-486, now called mifepristone, and usually a cytotec. One of them is, the first one sort of interrupts.
So it's like the first pill does one thing.
Correct.
And the second pill does something else.
Exactly. So the first one sort of interrupts the metabolic processes, so it interrupts the ability of the fetus to grow, and then the second one kind of helps your body expel it. Mm-hmm. We can actually do certain kinds of things just by using the second pill, just by giving, usually giving enough medication to cause contractions for the body to sort of release that. It makes it easier, healthier, and safer to sort of interrupt the growth of the pregnancy first. But that's two-stage, and the first one is the medication that's regulated, and that's highly regulated, so it does make it more complex.
It's highly regulated, but we're in this wave where we're making it more available.
Right, right. Because people are responding to the fact that there are people, at least in 26 states, that aren't going to have access to a clinic that will be able to provide an abortion, and so this need for telehealth and getting abortion medication via the mail so that one can self-manage their own abortion is becoming more important. But at the same time, and I think this is really the important thing when we're talking about this issue, is that the people who are anti-abortion are not going to be satisfied until they ban abortion everywhere in every way that they can.
Wow.
And so they're already looking at ways to restrict the ability for folks to get treatment via telehealth or be able to get things via the mail. And potentially, using those extra territorial laws to go after people who might be providing somebody assistance in a different state.
Yeah, from a legal, just real quickly,
Sure.
from a legal perspective, there's already a battle between the federal government and state governments that want to ban importation of the pill into the state.
I've heard that.
And so I think those kinds of conflicts are just going to be ratcheted up. And Merrick Garland recently basically has taken the very proactive position that states cannot, and they will prosecute officials in states that try to, go after the interstate mailing because the states don't have the right to do that. That's a federal.
Right.
That's a federal issue.
Right.
So it's going to get well, it's not going to get ugly. It's going to get more complex
Sure.
and uglier.
So I guess I'm a little concerned also, birth control in many forms has been around for a while, and I think we've kind of gotten comfortable with that. And then the Plan B pill has become more widely available, and I think we've gotten more comfortable with that. You can go down the shelves and just pull one. So this medical abortion pill, what are the risks associated with self-administering the self-abortion pill? Dr. Duncan.
So primarily the risks involve bleeding. So anytime you interrupt a pregnancy, there's a period of time where you're going to have bleeding. And this is with any kind of abortion. If it's, because your body has decided that on its own spontaneously that this isn't going to work, you're going to bleed, or if we're administering a pill. So the primary concern with that is bleeding, and usually the instruction is if you are miscarrying or if you are having a medical abortion, if you're bleeding more than 3 fully saturated pads in 1 hour, then you have to go to the hospital because there's a chance that you have to have a procedure, you have to have a blood transfusion, you may need sort of fluid support and things like that.
And for those who may not have access to health care, may not have insurance.
So the nice thing is that we do have very, very wonderful EMTALA laws here in the United States. If you are ill and you need care and you get onto a hospital, you put 1 foot onto hospital property, they are obligated to provide you care, stabilization, and transfer, and that is for anything. So if you go to the hospital because you are bleeding, you will get care.
But what about the medical bill that comes after that?
Now that is something different.
Yeah.
We will keep you alive. We will not kick you out. But the what happens after that is nice. Now, what is nice is that most women are, if they don't have insurance, are eligible for emergency Medicaid if they are pregnant. So if you have a positive pregnancy test, there is sort of a backdoor emergency Medicaid process, no matter what your legal status is or no matter what the situation is, that does sort of go back and handle anything regarding pregnancy. So if you come in hemorrhaging and you need a procedure, we can usually sort of get you emergency Medicaid that will then go back and handle it. That doesn't mean that every single piece of the process is handled.
Interesting.
But in terms of being cared for under those circumstances, like my fear is that people will not realize that they can go and get cared for, and they will not realize, and they will be afraid. And especially if you're in a state like Missouri, you're in a state like Texas where they've made all these threats. It's like, if you've done this, you're not going to go. So it's not that there's going to be a problem necessarily at the hospital, but you're going to stay home, and maybe you stay home a half an hour longer than you should have, or maybe you decide to take a nap instead of going to the hospital and you don't wake up.
That's scary.
And it's something that if you felt comfortable that your health was important, and that you were actually important, that anybody thought that you had any autonomy, then you would go to the hospital and get the care you need. But if you're afraid, you won't.
Well, and I think that point's really important about being afraid in these states, and that's really the terrible effect of these bans, is that yes, you may be able to go and get treatment if you're hemorrhaging, but people will be afraid that if they go, they're going to be criminalized. And that's going to disproportionately impact communities of color, particularly, who have a fear of the police or of other institutions and the government.
Yeah.
And so, again, this has real impact and real toll on people's lives.
Well, it's already something that a woman may be ashamed to do, right? And so if that woman is now having a complication as a result of something that she's doing in the dark, doing behind the shadows, and now she needs to get additional medical care and show up at the hospital and actually admit to being pregnant and admit to taking this abortion pill, and now I have a problem.
Now, the nice thing is I will put in is that, just so everybody knows, for this particular situation, it will not make a difference whether or not you self-administered medication. You were pregnant and now you're bleeding. That is all that matters.
Right.
So
Right.
there's many, many things that we
Right.
say you need to tell your doctor everything, and it
Sure.
actually makes a difference. And this does have some, there are some things, but I would say that out of everything to be afraid of, this is one of those cases where if you show up and you're like, I am pregnant and now I am bleeding, how that happened is much less important than what's actually going
Yeah,
on.
I wonder if the pregnant women feel that way, if they'll actually know that, and will they have that sense?
Probably not.
Right.
But
And especially if she's young, right? Maybe in college, but maybe she's 16.
or maybe,
Or maybe
she's
she's
13.
10.
Or maybe she's 10, right?
We had a recent case.
Yeah.
Yeah, or maybe she has an abusive partner.
Right.
You know, that there's all sorts of cases that are just absolutely heartbreaking. And again, this is why legislators should not be part of these decisions. It should be the person to decide their own bodily autonomy and what they want to do in their lives.
So that sounds like that's the right to choose, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, it covers so many other things, because I really want to make sure we really hit on this idea that this is intersectional, right? Roe is the first one to go, but that there are so many other fundamental rights that are now in the crosshairs. And
Yeah, I want to talk about that because Justice Thomas's dissent touched on the fact that there were other fundamental rights that may be at stake.
Yeah, I mean, it was a concurrence, right? Because he agreed with the majority.
Okay, right.
But yes, he basically said this is just the warm-up pitch, right? And he said this whole idea of a liberty interest, which is not expressly mentioned in the Constitution, that this confers any rights at all, is crazy. And so we should revisit the contraception cases. We should revisit the Supreme Court case that said that people have a right to choose their form of sexual intimacy in their private spaces. Same-sex marriages are at risk.
Are at risk
And
now.
all of those things kind of come out of the same soil, which is the idea of that you have certain rights that the state can't take away unless there are very compelling reasons. And of course, one of the things Justice Alito says in the majority opinion is, well, fetal life is different, and that's how he tries to make that distinction. But if you read the logic and the entire course of that decision, it does open the door to that, and Justice Thomas is willing, at least we know he's willing to walk right through it.
And we're already there in the state legislatures. I mean, if
Yeah.
you look at the issue
That's
of
right.
transgender people, there have been over 100 bills in state legislatures across the country introduced just this year, regulating and denying transgender people from getting trans-affirming care.
Wow.
If we look at the issue of contraception in my home state of Ohio, the person who is right now pushing the trigger ban in the state to ban all abortions said, she said, well, a rape is an opportunity if the person gets pregnant from the rape. And then she said, I would be open to banning all contraception next. And so these are the directions that people are going. So we're already in the pot of boiling water right now.
Gosh, so heavy. Okay, so what kind of bright light can we give to our viewership? What can we do? I mean, we're here.
Yeah.
We've got this conservative court. What can we do from an advocacy and really just from an educational standpoint? What do we do now?
On two things. I think on the education piece, this piece that we were talking about people not knowing their rights and not knowing what their protections are is really, really critical. And so I know several states, I know Illinois and New York, they've put out information from their Attorney General's office to educate folks about their rights. New York put together a group of pro bono attorneys who are going to be helping to represent people who might have legal challenges to seeking abortion care. But we need to do that type of education, I think, here in Delaware too, that yes, we have protected the right to get an abortion, but for many people who might just be following the national news, they might not know what all of their rights and their protections are.
Right.
And then I think the second piece from advocacy is there's so much more that we can also do.
Okay.
I'm really excited at the ACLU of Delaware. We announced this year we're doing a ACLU voter campaign where we're focusing on 5 key issues, and we're asking state legislators who are running for office and their opponents to answer questions. And one of the key issues that we're asking about is reproductive freedom, and we're going to be asking about Medicaid funding for abortion, whether or not they would put the protections for abortion in the state constitution and not just in the state law, whether they would make the laws easier for young people to be able to obtain an abortion. All of those are ways that we can actually move the ball forward.
Okay.
And so as bad as it is on the federal level, we can actually make advancements here in the state of Delaware if we continue to raise our voices and push our state legislators to go above and beyond.
Gotcha. And what do you think, Professor?
Well,
what's the bright light?
One of the things that is striking is that we have a Supreme Court that was put into place, at least in terms of the majority, by a president who was not elected by the popular vote, right?
Right.
We have a Senate that represents a minority because of the way the Senate is structured. We have a gerrymandered Congress. So the problems that come out of that are frustrating, because if you look at what the people are saying, something like 2/3 of people oppose the overturning of Roe versus Wade. So I think looking at that and focusing on what can be done, you can't do anything about the Senate, because one thing in the Constitution that you can't amend is the proportional, or is the two senators per state rule. That's one thing. I think it's the only thing that's in the Constitution that says you cannot amend this.
Okay.
But aside from that, there are other things that can be done. One of them is to get people out there voting, considering adding members to the Supreme Court, which a lot of people thought and still think is radical, but sometimes
I think
radical
it's needed, right?
times call for radical solutions.
Right.
Then you worry about a ratchet of like, well, the next time the Republicans get in, they add more, justices.
Right.
But there are problems that are in need of serious repair, and one of the things is sort of grassroots advocacy. If you have enough people in a state, and eventually at the federal level speaking, eventually maybe some of these elected representatives will listen. Real quick on Pennsylvania, the person who's running for governor from the Republican side is an extremist, Doug Mastriano, and favors abortion in no cases. And so I think that's actually going to harm him, because the state is much more moderate on that issue.
Yeah.
But it's a risk. If he somehow squeaks through, you could have a lot of Pennsylvanians traveling here as well.
Yeah, and I also think that it's important to note that as we talk about what we can do as Delawareans,
Right.
these states are just our close neighbors.
Yeah.
And so while someone may be living in Delaware today, if he or she decides to move into the state of Pennsylvania or move to a Missouri or something like that, to be aware of some of these issues that maybe he or she had not thought about because it didn't affect them. Because I think there is a lot of kind of like, oh, head in the sand, we're good here in Delaware, we're a blue state, we don't have to worry about that. But just choosing to move to another state could come with a whole host of restrictions to your rights.
Yeah.
So Go
I
ahead,
have
Dr.
two
Duncan.
thoughts. The first one, obviously, I think is, and what they said, is to vote. Choice voters often tend to take off the midterm elections, and we often, vote at a little bit lower rate at, sort of the lower level elections, and that's what we're seeing around the country, that, state legislatures and things like that are really have been taken over by a certain segment.
Right.
So we've got a very important midterm election coming up, and I would say don't take it for granted. There are 6 to 7 potential swing Senate seats that are in play, one of them being Pennsylvania, which had been, Republican, and there is a chance for it to flip. The other states out there, it's not perfect, but there is a chance.
Yeah.
So if we take it seriously, in the sort of midterms, instead of just paying attention to the big ones,
Right.
it would be helpful. From the medical perspective, I do think it's really important that we educate ourselves and that we understand like what these things are and what they mean, like what the medication means. So I find it very funny that people talk about when Plan B was released and going to the store and getting Plan B. Women have been using some variation of Plan B for many, many years prior to it coming on the market.
When you say some variation, what do you mean?
So Plan B is basically taking the medication that's in birth control pills and sort of reworking it into a form that is simpler in a way to administer. But most of these medications are simply a combination of 2 hormones that a woman's body makes, estrogen and progesterone. So all birth control pills are some variation of estrogen and progesterone. And it's just a dosage difference.
Wow.
So it's the same medication for hormone replacement therapy if you're in menopause. It's the same medication for Plan B. It's the same medication for birth control pills. It's the same medication to stop your bleeding. It's the same medication to kickstart your periods. It's just
high dosage.
different, sort of a different balance of dosages.
Yeah.
So if you understand that Plan B is actually like 6 regular birth control pills taken at one time.
Wow.
We don't have to have Plan B being very easily, available as long as birth control pills are. But oftentimes we overlook what things are and we think, oh, this one medication. Well,
That's partly because of how they're marketed and
correct.
patented. Right?
Exactly. That's exactly.
That's
Yeah.
it.
But
right?
it's still the same thing. So
Yeah.
if we understand like what these things are, how they work, if we look at the labels and we read what things are,
Which
we
so
understand
many
what our
of us
bodies
aren't,
are,
right?
we have a different idea. And I wish I could say that it was just, lay people that did it. So I have been, I graduated from medical school in '99, so I've been doing this for 24 years. New physicians don't realize that these are all the same medication
Wow.
sometimes.
Yeah.
Even the ones graduating, they go, wait, you all had a Plan B
Yeah.
before there was a Plan B?
And I think that's an important point to note too. I mean, as you say, the Plan B pill is like 7 or 8 regular birth control pills. I mean, I think that, a person can say, wow, that's a lot of pills if they actually saw all 8, but how it's packaged, it's just one small pill. And so I think people trivialize the significance of what's actually inside that little pill.
Correct.
And then to your point, the medical abortion pill is just 2 small pills, but it comes with a punch, right? And a punch that could be really detrimental to a woman's health.
But if we pay attention, if we pay attention, there are ways to know what can be done.
Okay.
And there are ways to understand how to stay off the radar and to take care of yourself the way that you need to take care of yourself.
Yeah.
It's not perfect.
Yeah.
But if we take the time to educate ourselves, we take the time to truly understand the medicine, we take the time to understand the pathophysiology, that to me is the light.
Sure.
The
because
other
there's
thing
not much of it.
that might be of interest is women telling their stories, but they shouldn't have to, right?
Right.
Because there's another aspect of this liberty, which is your privacy and your right to kind of not come forward. So, a lot of women are extremely courageous because they get vilified for it.
Yeah.
But, women talking about, okay, I wasn't raped, but it was coercion, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, you talk about abusive relationships, maybe they don't technically qualify as a rape, but we would see it that way. We would see it as coercive. So there are just so many different, it's a whole spectrum of reasons, which I think the more that's discussed, I think the better. And I think the pro-choice side has kind of simmered along kind of maybe too comfortably for a long time.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that, people talking about their abortions is important too, because it goes back to this idea too of, well, abortion isn't in the history of the United States. Well, abortion's been around since there's been pregnant people.
Right.
People have been ending their pregnancies since the beginning of time. And that in fact, it's been happening for centuries and centuries here in the United States.
So let me just...
The good thing is we have medication now that makes it safer and more effective.
Yeah. Well, this is a really great conversation. I think that I've certainly learned a lot, and I think everyone's perspective here has certainly provided some context around this case. So I'll ask our viewers to use the information that we received today from our guests. Get active, learn a lot, educate yourself, read the decision. What are your legislators doing? Can you send a letter? What kind of advocacy could you or should you be doing? And so I give you that charge to find out more about it, and don't just, especially for the men, poke your head in the sand and say it's a women's issue, because it's not just a women's issue, it's everyone's issue. I want to thank you guys for joining us tonight. I also want to thank my panelists. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Professor Culhane and Dr. Duncan, so much for joining us tonight. And this is tonight's episode of The Bar.